So we're going to start off assembling the quadruped robot. We're going to start with the controller board. So it's a green controller board. It has 4 screw and nuts placed through it. So at the moment I've got 3 placed here. So 1, 2, 3. I'm just going to put the 4th one in. So that's going to be a 3mm diameter 10mm bolt. So it goes through the hole, and the nut screws onto that, and the nuts are used as spacers, so it lifts the bottom of the PCB away from the base unit of the robot. So we just use a little screw to fix that in. So there we have 4 screws placed onto the PCB there. The connector here, the USB connector, that's going to go at the back of the body part of the robot, so that we can, if necessary, make a connection to it. So this is the body part of the robot. So that's the big square unit, and the hole here is actually the front. I've already mounted 2 of the servo motors onto here. What I'm just going to do now is to place the control board onto there. So that just fits through the 4 holes. Might need a little bit of persuasion to do that. That fits through. So what we now have to do is just add the 4 nuts onto the back of that to hold it in place. So that's 1, 2, 3. Remember, of course, that your body unit will actually be a university blue. This is the prototype in orange, so it makes slightly better TV. Just a little wrench you're provided with just to tighten those up. They don't have to be ever so tight. They're not load bearing or anything. They're just keeping the PCB in place. And there's just 4 to make it nice and even. You can actually get away with 2. So that's got those. Let's put the control board on. So remember, that's going to be the back and the hole is going to be the front. It's important for when we connect up the legs to the control board. We're going to be making the connections on, so the connectors on this side. It will get a bit complicated later on, so I'll just show you here now. So we're going to look at assembling one of the legs. We're going to make a left hand side leg. So there are 4 legs, 2 left hand legs and 2 right hand legs. The legs on each side are identical, but the left hand legs are a mirror image of the right hand legs. So we're going to start off. These are the parts we need. So we need the part here with a rounded end and 1 flat side. We need one with a rounded end, a large hole, and the rounded end at the other side. We need 1 leg, and we need 1 side plate. We need to open the servo bags, take out one of the servo motors and find the white single arm sided part. We need the tiny screw out the servo bag, that one there, and then we need one of the longer self-tapping screws. We're going to need a 2.5mm washer. We're going to need 2 2.5mm screws, 2 3mm diameter screws and 1 long 3mm diameter screws there. We're going to need 1 2.5mm bolt nut, 1 3mm nut. There's a little spanner there for doing things up, and then 3 lock nuts that we've got there. So those are the parts we need, and then the white arm from one of the other servo bags that's already on the base unit, and one of the larger self-tapping screws that go with it. So we're going to get the servo motor and we're going to hold it, so we're going to have the shaft of the motor at the bottom, and we're going to put a 2.5mm bolt through the top flange. Now the flange holes are slightly too small, so it can take a bit of an effort to get the bolts to start, but if you hold them in place and then just start to screw in the nut, after a few false starts it might work. So what we're going to do here is the bolts are actually just cutting a thread into the plastic, so it is by design. So it might be a little tight to start with, but then what we want to do is to screw that all the way in. Now we don't want to get these too tight because that just strips the thread, so once we get to there, so we're now right up against the flange with the head of the nut or screw, so just tight. Once it's tight, then just a tenth of a rotation backwards, that just releases the stress from the system. So we then get the orange part, and we want the rounded edge of the side plate on the left hand side, and we place the servo motor through that. Now this particular plate can go two ways. It could go that way or it could go that way. Only one of them is the correct way. So if we put it on, so it just sits over there, and if we look at the top here, what we can see is there's just a little bit of a lip, a little bit of a gap between the top of the blue and the plastic. Now we need that gap there. If we look at the bottom, then the flange of the blue flange is almost exactly the same position as the bottom of the side plates, and that's what we want. We want that little bit of extra space at the top. What we're going to do now is to put the other 2.5mm screw. That's going to go in from the other side, and that's going to go into the hole on the flange of the servo motor. That might look as if it's going in quite easily, but it can take a bit of effort to get that sorted out. So get it to bite and go through the hole. Don't make the hole any bigger. Don't be tempted to drill it out or anything, because then it won't self-tap. So we get it. Now we have to be careful here because this part is particularly prone to breaking. So make sure the top part is right up against the plastic flange, and that the bottom is also up against the plastic flange. Oops. And then just tighten it up till it seems to be about right, and then back it off maybe a quarter of a turn. So it's nice and tight. It'll move a little bit at the top, but that's okay. And that's now created that part. We now have to make the top plate. So the top plate is the rounded at one side and flat at the other, and we're going to put into that one of the one-armed white parts from the servo motor bag. We push that through the hole so it just fits nicely, and then we're going to take one of the longer self-tapping screws, so not the really tiny ones, but the longer ones. I'm going to put that through the slot into one of the pilot holes in the white plastic arm, and then just tighten that up. And what that does, it just holds the white plastic arm close to the part there of the leg. This part is then going to fit with the pointy part of the screw upwards, so the white plastic part goes on the top, and that's going to fit into there like that. It's going to be a bolt through there, and the way it's going to work is we take our 3mm nut, we've only got one of those, we place it through there, have to hold that nicely, it's a bit fiddly, put that over the top there, get one of the 3mm nuts, put it through the hole, fiddle about with it till it goes into the nut, and just tighten that up. Not tight, just tighten it up, just to make sure it's okay. And what we can see there, if you look carefully, you can see that at the bottom of the screw there's a little gap before the plastic, and that's what we want to see. If that screw is ever touching the plastic, then it's the wrong size bolt. You need to get rid of that and get a proper 10mm long one. If you try to screw it up too much, it will just snap this quite thin part here, so we don't want to do that. So that's in the right place, so I'll just give that tiny little bit of tightening, so that's fine now. So now that's can be put to one side. But now we're going to assemble the rest of the leg. So we're going to start off with this part here, so rounded at both ends. I'm going to take the other servo arm and just pop that through the large hole. Now if it doesn't seem to fit from one side, which this one doesn't really, if you turn it over it'll fit from the other side. That's just a manufacturing tolerance. It doesn't matter if you turn it over, it's symmetrical for this particular purpose. And then we put a self-tapping longer screw from the servo bag, screw that through, and that will just hold the white servo arm onto the plastic part. We're now going to assemble the rest of the leg. So we need to get the legs, so we've got the long curve on the left hand side. So this is going to be a left hand motor, so we make the long curve on the left hand side. And we start off by getting the long screw and we put that into the top hole. We then get one of these lock nuts. Now these are special nuts, they're 3mm. They've got an insert of nylon which hasn't got a thread, so you have to screw it through the thread, and that will then hold it against any vibration, which is what we want. So it can be a bit tricky because you've got to hold it there and then screw. So we use in a small spanner that you'll be provided with to do that. Hopefully you can just about see that. So as I screw that, it's going through. It's quite a long way. Okay. We want to get that tight and then back it off a bit so that the screw is free to rotate. Now we are going to tighten that later, but for the moment we want it free to rotate. We get the little thin plastic arm. It's got a 3mm hole at one end, 2.5 at the other, so we put the 3mm one over there. Get one of the other lock nuts, put that onto there. This is where it gets a bit tricky. So you've now got to hold the nut with the spanner, screw it in, now we do it up until it's tight and then back it off. So if it's tight, that little arm doesn't work very well, so we loosen it up a little bit, and that's now free to rotate. And now we're going to tighten the middle lock nut so that it holds it tight on the leg. Just tight and then back off a tiny bit. That one. Let's do that a little bit tighter. There we go. That's still quite loose. You'll see that's a bit wobbly now, so in fact what I'm going to do is I'm going to tighten that. That's now still loose, still rotates like that, but it's quite tight. I've now got this part to attach, so I'm going to use the 3mm diameter one I've got left. It goes through the leg, then it goes through the plastic part. I've got another lock nut which I put onto there. Eventually. It'll go on. There we go. Now we use the spanner again, going to tighten that up. So I'll tighten that up, finger tight, and then back it off a little bit so that that's also free to rotate. So I've now got the leg. So I'm now going to connect the leg to the rest of the servo arm, and the thin arm goes onto the, oops, missed something off. First of all, we have to put the 2.5mm washer. That's that one. That's the tiny washer. That's got to go on that top screw protruding through above the servo motor. That just gives a bit of leeway there. So that thin part goes on top of there, and then the servo arm pushes on. Remember, the servo motor should have been calibrated to their 90-degree position before you start this assembly. Now that's going to hold it together, so what we need is now the tiny little self-tapper from the servo bag. That can go into there. Not too tight, so tighten it up and then loosen it a little bit. If it's too tight, it won't rotate. Once we've got the servo arm on, we can move it up and down. That actually seems a little bit tight, so I'll loosen it a teeny bit. We can always tighten it up again later, or loosen it if we need to. And then finally, the 2.5mm nut goes onto here. Now this is a tricky one to get on, and also it mustn't be too tight. So really this is just finger tight, and it does have a tendency to fall off in use. It's not too much of a problem. We can just put another one back on. So that seems to be it. So it might seem a bit loose, but that's just the way it's made to be. So we need the looseness so it will easily move and whatever. And then we need to make another one exactly the same. So here's one I made earlier. So we now have two left hand legs. So front left, rear left, or the other way around, doesn't matter. We now need to make the right hand legs. Now the right hand legs are a mirror image of the left hand legs. So as a servo motor, it doesn't matter whether it's left or right, it will be exactly the same. I've already put the top screw from the back flange at the top, so the shaft goes at the bottom. I can now add the plastic plate. This time I'm getting the curved edge on the right hand side. So this is the right hand motor, so the curve is on the right hand side. Need to make sure that I've got that flange in, so the blue plastic at the bottom is exactly the same as the plastic part, so that's the right way up. So all I have to do now is to get my 3.5mm screw, sorry 2.5mm screw, put that in that way round so it will hold everything together. Screw that in. And as it's starting to nearly get there, I just need to make sure I don't snap this piece. This is very easy to snap this piece, so try very hard not to. So make sure this top end is down, so I had to push that down there. You may have heard it just crack a little bit. And then I've got to get that down as well. Okay, so it's now flat against the blue, and I can now finish off screwing it in. And I just tight and then a little bit back, and that just takes the stress of it. It's not bending it anymore. Just need to keep that motor down at the bottom. So I'm now going to attach the top part. Now the top plate's exactly the same as for the left hand motor, so I'm not going to show adding the white part. It's exactly the same. So we just need it to have to be on the top. I'm going to get my 3mm nut. Going to put that through there. Going to get this part, put it on there. Get 3mm screw bolt, put that in there. Make sure it's nice and loose. Tighten it up a little bit. Just make sure. Check. There we are. So we can see that the bolt doesn't actually get to the plastic, so that's fine. Tighten that up. That's fine. So now I'm going to make the leg. Now this is the right hand leg, so for the leg part I've got the curve, the long curve on the right hand side. Now I've already put the bolt in. I haven't finished tightening it up. It's exactly the same as the other one, just a mirror image, so I'll just tighten that up. Tighten it up and then undo it a little bit so it rotates. Get the plastic arm, get the 3mm hole, get another lock nut. This is the tricky bit. You've got to get that to screw and stay on, so with a bit of practice you can do it quite quickly. So tighten that till it's tight and then loosen it a little bit. It's still going round. Tighten the inner one. If it's too loose it flops about, So tighten it up and then undo it a tiny little bit. I think I might just do that a little bit more. Get ready. That's it. Make sure that's still loose, and then just tighten that up a little bit. Okay. That's still loose. That's a bit too loose. Oops. Tighten that up. That's now too tight, so I'll have to undo that. That's lovely. So I'll do that a little bit more. That's lovely. So the arm part it's exactly the same as the left hand motor, so I've already got one assembled here. So this time I'm going to assemble it from the left hand side, so it goes in like that. Get the bolt, put the bolt through the middle hole, put that through there. Got the other lock nut. The spanner. Tighten that up. I've tightened the finger tightness, 1/10 of a turn back, and that's now free. Oh, it's a bit tight actually. Tighten a little bit more and do that. That's fine. Yep. So now I need to put the 2.5mm washer onto that top one. That should fit down nicely. And I'm going to put that onto the topper, and then the arm part's going to go there. Again, make sure that the servo motor is calibrated to 90 degrees, and that should be at 90 degrees. It will be pointing directly across like that. So just to make sure that doesn't come off, put a tiny little self-tapping screw into the middle there. Tighten it and then undo it a little bit. Get the 2.5mm nut. Put that on there, and that just finger tightens, and that should go up and down like that. It's a tiny little bit tight maybe. Might need to loosen that bit. If the servo motors don't seem to work when it's powered up, then we'll just need to loosen everything a little bit. I think that's okay. And there we go, that's the right hand motor. So we then make another one like that. We'll have 2 right hand motors and 2 left hand motors. So I'm just going to show you the connections that are going to be made to the control board here. So it's on this side here. So on the right hand side, remember that this is the front of the robot where the big hole is. This is the rear, so this is the left and this is the right. So there are 8 connections here because there are 8 servos. So the way it works is each two connections, or each pair of connections, is one of the corners. So these first 2 connections here are the rear left motor, so that's the rear left rotation, and that's the rear left up and down. And the next 2 are clockwise around that, so that will be the front left rotation, that will be the front left up and down. Then you've got the front right rotation, the front right up and down, and then you've got the rear right rotation and the rear right up and down. This particular one has got 2 servos already put on, just to speed things up a bit. So I'll just show you how to put another servo on. So we get one of the servo motors out of its bag. You need to keep all the parts. The shaft for the motor is offset to one end, so we want that offset side to point outwards towards the corner. What we're going to do is we're going to put one of these are 2.5mm screws, so they're slightly thinner than the other screws, and we're going to be screwing up into the plastic casing on the flange of the servo motor. So it's not quite large enough, the hole's not quite large enough for the screw, so what that means is that we have to push it a little bit until the thread starts to bite, and then it holds. So I'm going to start by putting in that one there, and then I've just got to fiddle about with it so I can get it to start. So it can be a bit fiddly. You might have to try a few times, but once you've got it to start, it will then screw through, and you want to screw it through about 3 or 4 millimeters from through the top flange. So not completely tight. So that's that gap there. So I want to make sure there's a gap there, and that's plenty loose enough so that we don't break anything while we're putting in the other screw. So we're going to put the other screw in. The other screw goes in there, and again to get it in the hole. So that's done that, and then screw that tight again till it's about 3 millimeters out the top of the blue flange. Now we have to be very careful, because when we're doing this screw right at the corner, if you get it too tight it will snap the corner off. So the best thing to do is, once you've got both of them in, it needs to be loose, so not tight, and then we'll tighten up the inward one until it's starting to hold the motor securely. So that's just starting to hold it securely. Maybe a little turn more. That's nice and tight now, and then all I have to do is just tighten that a tiny bit. That's now holding that perfectly tight. So we don't need any nuts on here. The thread goes through the plastic flange and holds it tight, so we're able to save on that element. So I've now got all 4 motors added and the control board. So what I'm going to do now is to add the battery pack. So this holds 4 1.5 volt cells, so it's just over 6 volts power supply. The board itself's got an onboard regulator, so that will reduce that to 5 volts, and the servo motors will work off 6 volts. So what we have, there are 2 holes in the battery pack for mounting. I've already put a screw into one, and to do that we're going to use these countersink screws so that they don't get into trouble, they don't cause a problem for the batteries when they're placed in. So you should find that these screws go in relatively easy. There might be a bit of a tight feed because they're right up against the side there, so it may push right through, or you may have to just screw it through a little bit, and in possible extreme cases you might even have to get some assistance to make the hole larger. So once we've put that in, we're then putting this little pillar, and this just lifts off the battery pack away from the base, and it just enables it to go together more carefully. You'll see that it's not quite at a right angle, but I can just maybe bend that in a little bit. So I put that on, not too tight, so I've got both of them there, they're not too tight. And then I'm going to mount the battery pack on the bottom, and the wires that come out of the battery pack are actually going to go through this slot at the front of the piece of the base unit. So we need to put it in that way, otherwise those wires are not going to be long enough. And then we're going to use a short 3 millimeter diameter screw that's going to go into there. So that just fits into that pillar. That will do. So I don't do it all the way up because I might need to make some adjustments to it. Then I'll get the other 3 millimeter one, short screw, put that through the mounting hole, and this is where you might have to apply a little bit of pressure just to get the pillar to line up with the hole. So it shouldn't be too difficult. There shouldn't be any damage. It's just bending the battery unit, so you're not affecting particularly the base. So that goes in quite nice, and we can now tighten up the other one, and then we can tighten up inside so everything's held nice. It doesn't have to be overly tight, it's only holding it so it's neat like that. Okay, and then we can put the batteries in, making sure we put them in the right way round. Now we're not actually going to connect the battery at the moment, I'll just put them in just to give it a bit of weight to go at the bottom. So we're now getting to the point where we can add the servo motors. So we've got the base unit here with the 4 rotation servos on, we've got the control PCB, and we've got the battery pack on the bottom. So we're now going to add the 4 legs, and we've got 2 legs for the left hand side and 2 legs for the right hand side. Now these are mirror images. They're not the left hand ones are not the same as the right hand ones, so you have to be careful about that. So when we assemble the legs, that was carefully pointed out, so we need to make sure that we get the left hand legs on the left hand side and the right hand legs on the right hand side, remembering that the slot is the front. So what I'm going to do is to put this first leg on here. So this is the right hand side rear leg. Now with the way it's assembled, it should just fit onto the top of the servo motor. The servo motors have all been calibrated to be at the 90-degree point, and we can see that that's just gone on there. Now that actually won't stay there on its own. You're just going to put one of these very tiny servo screws. Now there are 2 types of screws provided with the servo motors. These very, very tiny ones which go into the top of the servo motor shaft, there to hold the servo motor arm, those white plastic bits on. So that's that. And then there are some longer ones which we've used here to hold the white arms to the plastic part. So we did that previously. So when we're putting this top on, we have to make sure it will still rotate. Once we've put the servo on, we can rotate it. It will keep its calibration position. If we do this center screw up too tight, then this will become very stiff and it won't move. If it's too loose, it can fall off. So we have to get it just right. So the way to do it, tighten it up and then undo it, maybe a quarter turn, something like that. That screw is really just to make sure it doesn't come off. Now that's just a pivot point at the top. We now have to put the pivot point on at the bottom. So we're going to do that with one of these pieces that we've previously assembled. So this is the round ended part, and with flat at one end. We put a bolt through there, so that's a 10 millimeter long bolt. We put a washer on the top that just raises that bolt up to exactly the right position, and a nut underneath, because that's going to be the pivot point underneath. We need a nut for the 3 millimeter bolt. That's going to go there, and what we have to do is to get that nut into that slot there. That's not very easy, but if I find that if I do it this way, I can just slide the nut in. Now it's quite a big slot, so it just flops about. I then hold the nut in place with my left hand, just like that. I get the bottom piece, so that will go into that. So the screw here goes into the hole, and the slot goes into there. And then all I have to do, without disturbing anything, is get another 10 millimeter long, 3 millimeter diameter bolt, the screw, put it through there, and just tease it into the nut, work it into the nut, holding the nut in the right place, and it will then go in like that. So just tighten it up a little bit. It doesn't have to be overly tight, or best not to over tighten it. And there it is. Now the important thing is to see that this particular bolt that we're using, there's a gap from the end of the bolt to the red plastic. Now that gap's important as it relieves the stress on the 2 sides of this side plate here. We don't have to have that overly tight, it just needs to be finger tight, so that's fine. And that's now that leg done. So that's the left rear leg perfectly assembled. Now I've added the other motor to the left hand side of the robot, so we've got the rear left and we've now got the front left. So now I'm going to add the right hand rear, so that's going to be added in exactly the same way. Now remember, these have to be calibrated to exactly 90 degrees, and if they're at 90 degrees it will be the diagonal of the square base. So we can just put the motor on, get one of the tiny screws, making sure we don't drop them on the floor where they're impossible to find. Screw that in so it's just a little bit tight, and then I'll reverse it a little bit, and that should now rotate. That might be a little bit tight. You can hear it's not quite as free as the other motors. The motors do vary a little bit, so they won't all sound the same. As long as it's free, we can always loosen it or tighten it at a later time. So now we've got to get that nut into that position in this point again. So we take the 3mm nut. We're going to put it through into the slot first. Hold it with my left hand. Then I'm going to get the bottom plate, put it into its locating slots and holes, get another 3mm diameter 10mm screw, screw that in by hand, so just tease it in. It will go in quite nicely if you get it all aligned perfectly. If you don't get it aligned perfectly, it can be a bit of a faff. Again, we make sure that the bottom of the screw doesn't reach to the bottom of the slot where it goes into on the side plate there. So just make sure that's properly tight, so not too tight. And then just to show you that wasn't a fluke, I'll do the next one, which is now the last one. So this is going to be the right hand front leg. That's gone on. That might be quite right, but we can always adjust it if we need to. These are relatively easy to take off and just readjust if we want to. The legs don't need to be taken apart, they just need to be removed. It's just 2 screws. They're really just held together mostly with friction and the weight of the robot. So that's now in the right place. That's a little bit tight. There we go. So now we've got to get that nut, that one last nut. So obviously the wires are starting to get in the way. We've got 8 wires because there are 8 servos. So it can get a little irritating. So we've now got the last nut to put into that slot. Hold it with my left hand. Get the final plate. So that bolt goes into the hole. The slot connects to the slot on the. Oops. Not going to happen quite as nicely this time. I dropped it. Try again. That was just to show you that it can be a bit fiddly, and it's easy to actually drop apart or parts not go together. But anyway, you now have all 4 legs onto the system like that, and so we can start to connect them up. And we're going to connect them up as I said, so remember this is the back and we start connecting from this side here. So this is the left hand side rear connector motor, the first 2. Now the first one is the rotation, so that's this one that's placed on the base unit. You'll see there are 2 ways of putting it in. Or these motors have 3 wires, an orange, a red and a brown. Servo motors have some different ones, but generally the middle one is red and the right hand one is either black or brown. The red one represents the power supply and the brown one or the black one represents ground volts, and that means that the orange one, which on this side is on the left, represents the signal. And when we're connecting them up on this row of connectors here, the signal pins are on the left hand row of those 3. So what we can do, make sure we've got the left hand, we've got the orange on the left, and then we can just push that onto there. We then take the servo motor, which is the up and down part of the leg, make sure we've got the orange part, and push that on to there. That's easy enough. We then take the left hand front, so that's the rotation one. Make sure the orange is on the left. That connects to the next connector. Then we get the next one, which is the left hand front leg up and down, orange on the left. Connect that up. Now these connectors do go together very tightly, so we're going round in a clockwise direction, so we now want the motor one for the front right. So this is the front right rotation one, orange on the inside. Connect it to the next set of pins. Then we want the front right up and down, orange on the left hand side. It goes to the next one. So we've now got one motor left, so we've got 2 rows of pins left to connect that to, and it's starting to get more difficult to actually get them in. They're just a tiny bit too wide. So we get the final one, so that's the right hand side rear motor, so that's the rotation one. That's now the 7th one to be connected with the orange on the inside. And then the final, I didn't get that one right. Oops, I haven't got it right. There we are, got that right. And then the final motor is the right hand rear, and that's the leg up and down. Again, make sure the orange wires are on the left hand side. Now this is the one that can be the most tricky to get in. So we can have a look at that. Hopefully you can see we've got all of the connectors in. They're all aligned perfectly. If any of them sticking out or in, it means we haven't quite got them on the right connectors, and you can just take that one off and put it back on. Try not to pull these connectors off using the wires, because the end plugs will come off and then you're going to need a new servo motor. And that's it. So it's now ready for the rest of the experiment. There. Remember, this is the front.